So I'm really excited to be here. I was here last year, and I heard Cameron speak about raising your kids to be entrepreneurs. And I promptly went home and took my children's allowances away. So I hope I can inspire you today to make some small changes in your life after today. So my name's Jessie, and I'm really nervous today. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about myself. And I figure once you see me in a swimsuit, I shouldn't be nervous anymore. So I'm a mom. I have 2 kids. They're 7 and 9. I have lived in Edmonton's inner city for about 20 years. I have been a restaurant worker or manager for about 25 years. 10 years ago, my husband and I bought our own restaurant. And I really like good food, and I really like to shop. I started a nonprofit a couple years ago, and if you've ever had a conversation with me, I have probably told you to eat local, to shop local, to dine local, and to order some food from the Good Food Box. That's a pretty standard thing for me. Apparently when I was little, I liked to fish, and I liked to trap gophers. And I think my mom let me wear my pajamas pretty much whenever I wanted to. So today I'm going to talk about local. I'm going to talk about local economy, I'm going to talk about our local community, and I'm going to talk about local business. And I just want to stop and define, when I say local business, what I'm talking about. They are businesses that started in your community. They likely have an owner in your community. They could be a regular store you walk into, you buy something. Could be an artist that generates art in your community. Could be an author that writes and sells books in your community. It could be a nonprofit that someone started in your community. Could be often referred to as a family business or a community-based business. It could be an accountant that runs an accounting firm that does books in your community. The things that I'm not talking about are any business that's in your neighborhood. I'm not talking about chains. I'm not talking about franchises. I'm not talking about public companies. So when I talk about a local business, I'm talking about a very specific kind of a business. I'm also going to talk a lot about shopping and eating. And I'm under no illusions. I'm not encouraging you to shop more. I'm not encouraging you to eat more. In fact, we should likely all shop less. And I don't know if we should eat less, but we should eat all of the food that we buy. We have a tendency to waste a lot of food in North America. Now, I'm going to ask you to think a little bit differently about the things that we do every day. And I started to learn about this a few years ago. I have to say, for the first probably 35 years of my life, I never really gave a second thought to local. I liked my community, I liked working, but I never really understood how those things affected the community that I lived in. Now back, let's say 5 or 6 years ago, the oil boom was coming. I had bought my restaurant and I was really excited. I was a teenager in the 80s when now you know how old I am, when the first oil boom hit. But I was under the impression that an oil boom would be really good for our community. Be lots of business, lots of money, lots of customers, and just generally a really positive thing. I'd always believed that a rising tide would raise all boats. When the boom started, we saw new subdivisions being built. We saw new businesses coming to town. Everybody was hiring. It was a great and exciting place to be. We also saw South Edmonton Common. 320 acres of shopping excitement, in addition to West Edmonton Mall. Now, I like to shop. That is really cool. But then, as we got a little bit farther into the boom, I started to notice some impacts and some things in my neighborhood that I wasn't so happy with. I noticed that there were more prostitutes on my street. I noticed that there was more drug use in my community. It wasn't uncommon to see people shooting up or smoking crack, and to do things right in public that we weren't accustomed to seeing. There was also more crime. 1 week in 2005, well, over 6 weeks, my car got broken into 6 times, so once a week for 6 weeks. I also noticed that there were more homelessness. It was not uncommon in my neighborhood to see people pushing shopping carts down the street, but in the boom we saw way more of them. And in my neighborhood, it's very diverse. I noticed that my low-income neighbors were having a hard time staying in their homes. I had an opportunity one day to go on a tour of the food bank, and this was in the height of the boom. And I don't know if you've ever been to the food bank, but it's absolutely overwhelming at the size and the scale of the food bank and of all of the food that's required to feed people that can't afford to feed themselves in our city. And I was talking to Marjorie Benz, and she's the executive director there. And she told me that during the boom, their demand had far exceeded anything they'd ever seen before. And I was shocked by that. I'm like, what's going on when we're having this all this money is coming through our city, and yet all of these negative things are happening. And right around the same time, the 2006 census results came out. And this chart, now I'm not a statistician or economist or anything like that, but I think this chart really kind of lays it out. In Canada, the blue line is the bottom 20% of families. The yellow line is the middle 60% of families. And the green line is the top 20% of families. And this is their income from 1976 to 2005. And you can see that really for 80% of our population, or 80% of our families, there's been no real growth in incomes for a really, really long time. And for me, there's something fundamentally wrong with this. I think those lines should all be getting a little bit closer together, and I think they should all be trending upwards. Now, we're never going to have everybody make the same income, and I don't think that should be our goal. But I do think we should be trying to reduce income disparity and trying to increase the general, level of income and quality of life in our community. I also found this graph, and this is income for farmers. Now, I grew up on a farm, my dad's a farmer, my brother's a farmer, and my brother had always went up north and worked in the oil patch, and I never really understood why. And then I saw this graph, and I'm like, oh, that's why. It shows that, average farm income for the last 20 years, it's been an average loss. And that's shocking to me. Like, how can we have an industry where that's the average? And it was also disappointing to see that really, the only time the farmers made any money was in the 40s to the 80s. I'm not sure I'd be tempted to be a farmer if I saw a graph like that. At the same time, a report on childhood poverty came out. It was, again, a little bit frightening for me. It showed that in Alberta, 1 in 10 children live in poverty. And in Edmonton, it's 1 in 6. And of those children, 78% had parents that worked. And again, I think we should be a little bit embarrassed of that. One day, my daughter came home from kindergarten, and we do live in the inner city. She came home and she says, Mommy, I want to forget my lunch tomorrow. And I said, Mason, why do you want to forget your lunch? And she says, well, Mrs. Richards has special lunches for kids that don't have any. And I was a little surprised by this, so I went and I asked Mrs. Richards, and she said that their school qualified for the hot lunch program. But the agency that supplied the hot lunch program didn't have the resources to supply all of the schools that qualified for the hot lunch. So Mrs. Richards went to the food bank, she got donations from grocery stores, and she fed kids breakfast, she made them lunches, and in certain circumstances, she actually packed food home for them so they could take them home and have supper. Again, I was like, this is not the kind of province or the kind of community that I think we should be living in. I think things like this should be reduced or eliminated. Personally, I also noticed that as the economy got hotter, it became more difficult for my business to be profitable. We had lots of customers, but our costs were going up, our staff needed more money, everything became just a little bit more challenging. I also noticed that many of the businesses that I like to shop in were closing. And when I had the opportunity to ask the owner why they were closing, I heard a variety of different reasons. And sometimes it was, I'm ready to retire, I can't find anyone to buy it, so I'm just gonna close it. In some cases, it's like, my lease is up for renewal, it's gonna triple, and it just doesn't make sense for me to continue. But I didn't really think that this was appropriate. This was not what I expected to see as our economy was getting hotter. And then I had an opportunity to go to Austin. I was invited to a meeting, and I didn't really have an interest in going to the meeting. It was about local business, but I had a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I'm like, okay, I can get out of town for a couple of days, ditch the kids in here up and ground, and maybe go learn something. And at the meeting, it was interesting. I heard a lot about shopping local, and I heard a lot about keeping Austin weird, and I met some really cool people, but I still didn't really get it. And I was sitting beside a man at lunch, and his name was Steve, and he owned a bookstore. And I'm like, Steve, I get why people would come to my restaurant and pay a little bit more money for a dinner. We use a lot of local products. I've got a chef that's really, really talented. It's an intimate restaurant. But I don't really get why someone would come to your bookstore and pay more for that book when they could buy it online or at a big bookstore for less money. Why would we do that? And Steve, he's kind of gave me the stock answers. He's like, well, I've got a great selection of books. He goes, you go into one of those big bookstores and they have a lot of books, but they don't have a lot of variety. He says, my staff are really, really knowledgeable. They've read a lot of books. They can find books for you. You come in and you say, I heard about this book, and they can figure out where it is and what book you're talking about. He says, and we give great service, and we work with our community, and we give back. He says, and when you spend $100 in my bookstore, the city of Austin gets an additional $45 in local economic impact. He said, and if you went to a national bookstore and you spent that same $100, the city of Austin would only get $13 worth of local economic impact. And I was like, hold on, how can that be? You're telling me I can go to your bookstore and buy some books, or I can go to a national chain bookstore and buy the same books, and if I buy them in your bookstore, I'm gonna triple the value of that transaction to my community. He's like, yep, that's what I'm telling you. I'm like, how do you know? He's like, well, we did a study a couple years ago. An economist came in and they did this, and that's what it said. And I'm like, okay, Steve, nice to meet you. I didn't really believe him. I was skeptical. I came back to Edmonton, and I found this study online, and I read it. And I went, oh. And then I realized, before I owned my own restaurant, I worked for large restaurant chains. And most of that money that came into my restaurant left my community. Now I paid my rent, I paid my utilities, and I paid my staff. But we had national contracts for our food. We had national contracts for our repair companies. We had national contracts for maintenance. And all of our business support services, so the accountants, the graphic designers, the advertising, the construction, the design, all of that stuff happened out of Toronto. And I was like, okay, now at my restaurant, virtually none of the money that comes into my restaurant leaves my community. I pay my rent, I pay my staff, I pay my utilities, but almost all of my suppliers are local companies. And, technically my head office is here, it's in the back of my restaurant. I'm it. So when I need an accountant, or I need a bookkeeper, or I need graphic design, all of those services are sourced here. So it started to make sense. And I dug a little deeper, and I found similar information from other places. There was a study out of Seattle that showed that if the people in Seattle shifted 20% of their food dollars to their local food system, so independent grocery stores, independent restaurants, farmers markets, it would increase the annual incomes in that region by over $1 billion a year. And that was amazing. I'm like, you know, we as a community have this vision. When you talk to people, it's like, we want to live in vibrant communities. We want to live in exciting neighborhoods. But we don't understand how the things that we do every single day impact our community. And it's not about big business and small business. It's not about good business and bad business. It's about understanding that local business has a different impact on our community. If we want to have a vibrant community, we need to make sure we have vibrant businesses. Nobody ever tells me, I want to live in a community with more people living in poverty, where more kids should go hungry, and there should be less opportunity. I mean, we need more of this, and we need less of this. So how can we use our communities or our businesses to transform our communities? In 2007, we spent over $60 billion in our province shopping. We spent $17 billion eating. So by shifting a portion of our spending, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 50%, we can significantly change what our community looks like. It's not a big change, it's not revolutionary, it's just spending our money differently. We've got tons of great business owners in our community that have been doing things to make our community interesting. And now, do I know that shifting our spending to local business will transform our communities? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure. And I think it's a pretty low risk. I mean, we can buy things in different places and see what happens. I think we'd be surprised at what kind of difference it would make. Thank you.